How you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
Not bad, not bad.
Nice background. I like it.
Yeah, it's Northeastern is really good with the virtual images, so this is part of the campus somewhere.
Great. So Tim, I'll give just a short introduction, and then I'll let you introduce yourself.
Oh,
Uh,
fine.
and uh, I mean, I have a presentation. I'll go through it. It'll probably be 15 or 20 minutes or so, and then we'll take questions.
Yeah, I'm sure you'll be
That makes
answering.
sense. My grammar might be off today, but you can give me a desk edit. How's that? Oh, we have people coming. Great.
Thank you, everybody, for logging in. We'll get started here in just a minute. Susan, can you mute?
Sorry.
That's good. All right, welcome everybody to the Publishing in AMD session. My name is Kevin Rockman. I'm the incoming editor-in-chief for AMD, and I'm thrilled that you're all here today. Of course, we wish we were in Vancouver instead of my dark, dank basement with my sad whiteboard and my attempt at welcoming everybody to AMD. But this was the only place to hide from my family and my little ones while trying to host this session. So I am glad that you're all logged in. Hopefully we'll give you some good information, not only about AMD, but about some of the new initiatives we have at AMD and that are coming down the road. Before we get started with the first part of our talk, which I'll give a short presentation, I want to talk to you about our team. Our managing editor at AMD is Mike Malgrande. You might be familiar with him if you've submitted to AMJ in the past. And I have a team of 9 excellent associate editors: Marlis Christensen from the University of Toronto, Susan Cohen from the University of Pittsburgh, Eric Dane from Washington University in St. Louis, Joachim Henkel from Technical University of Munich, Monica Higgins, who's at Harvard, Tim Hoff, who I'll introduce here in a second, Chi-Han Lee, who's at George Mason with me, Jochen Menges, who's at University of Zurich and Cambridge, and Georg von Crow, who's at ETH Zurich. As I mentioned, Tim Hoff, who's one of our associate editors. Tim is at Northeastern and is actually studies not only management, but also healthcare management. We're thrilled to have him on the team, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. Tim Hoff, professor of management and healthcare systems at Northeastern, and I'm newly assigned to the associate editorial board, and really happy to be a part of AMD and work under Kevin and stewardship. And so I hope you get a lot out of the session, and welcome. Thanks for coming today. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Tim. As I mentioned, each of these individuals is extremely well accomplished, qualified, and they're passionate about AMD and what we're trying to do at AMD with empirical exploration. We also have about 170 members on the editorial review board at AMD, many of which are new. Our members on the ERB at AMD are folks that have published in AMD, have been excellent reviewers for AMD, are past associate editors for AMD, or again, otherwise passionate about empirical exploration and the mission of AMD. You can learn more about our associate editors and our editorial review board by going to the AMD website. I'll talk more about the website here in a little bit. It's always a great resource if you're looking to know more about AMD. Go find these people, talk to them, email them, and ask about their experiences with the journal. Okay, so I'd like to spend a little bit of time telling you about AMD and what distinguishes AMD from other journals. AMD, as you may or may not know, is still a relatively young journal. We started publishing in 2015, and obviously compared to AMJ, which I think just had its 62nd or 63rd birthday or something like that, we're just a baby and still, of course, figuring things out and educating people about the journal. And obviously that's why we're here today. So I'm going to share my screen and pull up a presentation, which is just a few slides, but it will give you some of the content that might be helpful to you. This presentation will also be shared on the same site that you used to log in today to come to the session. All right, so AMD, we say, is the Journal for Empirical Exploration. Well, what does that really mean? Like, what is empirical exploration? Like, aren't we always doing empirical exploration? And the answer is no, right? Empirical exploration is, of course, data, right? This is a journal where it's an empirical journal. We always have data in AMD papers. And it's really for situations where you're trying to explore an unexplained phenomenon, right? You see something happening in the world, whether that's within individuals or teams or companies, organizations, or industries, and we don't have a lot of pre-existing theory or knowledge about that phenomenon, right? So maybe you have data or have access to data or want to design a study where you're simply going out to explore. And that obviously that could be qualitative, where you're asking people or doing some sort of ethnography or so forth, but it could also be quantitative, where you're mining your data or you're conducting an experiment where you don't have strong pre-existing notions for why things are happening, right? And so, we say at AMD that there are no hypotheses, right? We don't engage in sort of formal deductive hypothesis testing at the journal. And it's probably the single biggest mistake that authors make when they submit to AMD, is they take a paper that maybe they've written or has been rejected at another journal, which has formal hypotheses, and they send it directly to AMD. There's really, there's no chance that paper will go under review at AMD, right? As editor, it's my job to desk reject or desk edit those papers. And those go straight back to the authors with an explanation about what AMD is. So if we're not doing formal hypothesis, what does a paper sort of look like? What are these, what are these discoveries? Well, there's a couple of different ways that you might come about a discovery, right? The first way is, as I mentioned, is from really viewing the world around you, right? You're constantly observing phenomenon, how individuals, as I mentioned, individuals or dyads or teams or units or networks or organizations or industries, how they act, behave, change, and otherwise exist in the world. right? You might see something that is interesting and not well understood and go out to collect data to unpack that phenomenon that you're viewing. So that's very much a sort of, you're viewing the world, you see something interesting, and you decide to go collect data on that, right? And really explore sort of what's going on there. With my own paper that appeared in AMD, we were interested in telework, and we collected all sorts of data on telework and what was happening in this organization that was employing a lot of teleworkers. Turned out that was turned out to be more applicable than we thought it might be at the time, but we didn't have strong pre-existing theory for what we were collecting and why. The second way is from viewing or going through a particularly interesting data set, right? Perhaps you see something in a data set that is indicative of a potential discovery. Again, something that's interesting and not well understood. Such data mining, which might be not welcome in other journals, is very much welcome in AMD, right? That's what we're trying to help our authors understand, is that AMD is at the stage of knowledge development before we have strong theory in order to make predictions, right? We want to feed into journals like AMJ, or even journals like AMR, where the output of an AMD paper is going to be a theoretical contribution or a plausible explanation for what might be happening with that phenomenon. Now, so what distinguishes AMD? Well, the first thing, and you can find this on the website, is that, and I'll read this for you, AMD is a premier journal for the empirical exploration of data, describing or investigating compelling phenomenon. AMD is, as I mentioned, not a journal for deductive theorizing or hypothesis testing. Authors are encouraged to present findings without the need to reverse engineer any theoretical framework or hypotheses. Excuse me. AMD publishes discoveries resulting from the data mining of both quantitative and qualitative data sources. So the thing I want to emphasize here, with this sort of first distinguishing characteristic, is that you don't have to engage in theoretical contortionism for AMD. And we've, I know I've done this. I've had interesting findings, and sort of the findings you want to talk about and the contextual things you want to talk about, but you're struggling with that theoretical frame, or what theory are you building? And that's you're trying to sort of reverse engineer that theory, and that's really difficult to do. In fact, most of the time, reviewers and editors pick up on that, and your paper gets rejected, right? I've definitely had that. I've had that experience. I had journals, and now, sort of looking back, I can see why some papers were successful at a journal like AMJ and why some papers weren't, because we don't always have really strong theoretical frames, right? We don't always have the luxury of, having a nice model, in our minds before we go out into the field. And I've, personally, I've had this experience with both survey data and qualitative data, but we've seen papers with macro level data have this, go through this same process where they just don't have strong theory, but they have really interesting discoveries. If you find yourself in that position, AMD could be a great journal for you. Next. So the next thing, and this is relatively new for the journal, but we're trying to better convey how to write up or structure a paper. And in fact, on the website under submitting to AMD, you will actually find some language helping you decide or structure your paper in a way that might fit AMD. So we say that AMD articles are context forward rather than theory forward. Right? This means that AMD papers look quite different than articles sent to other empirical journals. The goal of the front end of an AMD paper should primarily be to demonstrate the novelty or the interestingness of a phenomenon and why current theory fails to explain such a phenomenon. Right? It's in the discussion of an AMD paper where a plausible theoretical explanation or the theoretical contribution is provided, right? So I'll emphasize this again. AMD articles are context forward. Now, what does that mean? It means that the front part of an AMD is getting your audience excited about the phenomenon that you are studying. What do we know about that phenomenon? What do we not know about that phenomenon? Why is this phenomenon important to understand? And I'll give you an example, and apologies if you were in the Meet the Editors session on Thursday, I gave this same example. I talked with Kim Ellsbach a couple of years ago. And she had come to Mason to give a presentation, and she was talking about this paper that she had worked on with Beth Betschke about crying in the workplace. And it's a fascinating paper. And what's fascinating about the paper is the phenomenon, right? It's crying in the workplace and what they observed about crying in the workplace. That's the context, right? And sort of what was happening in the workplace, what were some of the dynamics that caused these individuals, again, these women that they were studying, to cry in the workplace. And they really wanted to write a paper about crying. Of course, when they sent that paper to other journals, it was, well, no, this isn't a paper about crying. You need to make this a paper about emotion, or you need to make this a paper about identity, or you need to make this a paper about power, or whatever it is. And Kim's like, well, we didn't want to write a paper about identity, right? We wanted to write a paper about crying. And so you can make a different contribution at AMD because we allow you, in fact, we encourage you to put the context and the phenomenon up front. And they actually had some really interesting, plausible explanations for why they saw what they saw in their context, which do link to theory, but that comes at the back end of the paper, right? So the theoretical contribution does exist, but it comes towards the end, right? So where you're trying to explain that discovery or those discoveries. So it's almost like switching things around a little bit from a traditional manuscript. That's why we encourage authors, if you've had a paper at another journal and you want to send it to AMD, don't just send it to AMD because it's got to look different to be an AMD article. And there's plenty of, we've now published something like 100 articles in AMD since 2015. There are plenty of examples out there where you can see, oh, this is what an AMD paper looks like. So the front end of the AMD is not to justify your hypotheses. It's not to review theory. It's to offer convincing justification of your research question. Why is this important? Why is it timely? Is it affecting lots of people or organizations or industries or whatever it is? And why do we not have pre-existing theory that explains what's going on? Right? That's what is contained in the front end of an AMD. By the way, I should have mentioned this earlier. We will take questions at the end, so you can either put them in the chat. Maybe you're already doing this, and we'll monitor that chat. And I'll also give you time to raise your hand in the end if we have time to do that. Okay, so what's the third thing? The third thing, and this is one of our new initiatives, is that we strongly support creativity in writing and presentation. And while, of course, creativity is encouraged in every AMD submission, and we want you to be creative and innovative, we've relaunched Discoveries in Brief, which is designed to promote this objective specifically. Our goal with this type of submission is to work with authors to use their own voice to turn stylized facts into compelling stories for any audience. Right? Our team will collaborate with authors to determine which submissions are most appropriate for full-length manuscripts and which are best for this idea, which is Discoveries in Brief. Right? We're really trying to do something different here. And the tagline for Discoveries in Brief is under 20 pages, under 20 references. Some of our friends in the hard sciences already do this. And following them, we also encourage authors who are sending in Discoveries in Brief to put their methods and maybe even some of their findings in an appendix. You do not need to follow the traditional academic structure when you're writing a Discoveries in Brief article. In fact, we don't want you to. We want you to create a compelling narrative. Now, the methodological requirements are exactly the same for Discoveries in Brief. Just because it's shorter doesn't mean it's easier, or you don't need as many subjects, or you don't need as many interviews, or whatever the case may be. We still want the highest methodological rigor, but we want to do it in a way that's even more accessible and, we dare say, interesting for our audiences. I don't know about you, but I think it's been a long time since I grabbed a journal and sat in bed and just thumbed through and said, man, these are really awesome articles to read. I do what most of us do, right? You read abstracts and then you put it aside. You read abstracts, you put it aside. We're trying to do something different here, right? Think of this as like feature-length magazine articles. Really compelling, interesting, gripping to read from the start to the finish. That's what we want to create with Discoveries in Brief. And then finally, Another new initiative and another distinguishing characteristic for AMD is that we welcome pre-registration studies. Now, if you're not familiar with pre-registration is the idea where you're submitting essentially a proposal to go out and do research. And we call these registered reports. So when you submit a registered report to AMD, you're submitting everything except for the findings. Right? You're basically telling us, again, the phenomenon, why the phenomenon is important to study, why we don't have pre-existing theory to study this phenomenon. You're justifying your research questions just like you would. And you're telling us everything that you know about your methodology. So we have confidence that you know what you're doing, that you're going to go out and you're going to study this phenomenon effectively, and that we're going to get something interesting, an interesting discovery out of this data. Now, the reason that we do this is one, we want other journals to be doing this as well. We think this is important for science. Pre-registration helps limit problems like harking or p-hacking and so forth. But also, and those problems are not necessarily as important for AMD because we don't have hypotheses. But what it does is it encourages authors not to throw negligible results in their file drawer, right? Or to never be seen again. And I'll give you like the classic example is, you have an organization that is doing some sort of diversity initiative, and whether or not that initiative is working or isn't working is equally interesting, right? We don't necessarily know the mechanics of why it might be working or why it may not be working, but you have access to data that shows whether or not the effectiveness is there. That's a great example of a nice candidate for a registered report, where you're going to tell us about the organization, you're going to tell us about the initiative, you're going to tell us about what they're trying to do, and if it's working or if it's not working, great, right? That's an interesting discovery, and then it protects the author from going and collecting all that data and then finding, oh yeah, it's working, great. Maybe you think that's not interesting, but it actually could be quite interesting, and that's what we're trying to get at with the registered reports. Okay, a couple of other quick things to know about publishing in AMD, and then I will stop and we will take some questions. The first thing is that we use a reviewer template at AMD, and this is actually a good time. Well, actually, I'll do that here in a second. So we use a reviewer template at AMD. This is a series of questions that every reviewer will answer. We don't let reviewers, or we don't want reviewers to freelance and write an essay like we typically do with most reviews. We want to make life easier for our reviewers and more direct in terms of the feedback for our authors. As I mentioned before, we have a paper template to help you on the submitting to AMD page, which I'll show you here in just a second. And we also have an extensive FAQ on the website. Let me switch over to the web here just for a second, and I will show you this. Not seeing that. Oh, that's why. So if you look at my screen, here's the AMD website. And you can see the things that distinguish AMD right here on the homepage. Please do read those. You can read more about discoveries in brief here. You can read more about pre-registration studies here. And most importantly, as I was just mentioning, it says right here at AMD, we use a reviewer template, right? So you can go right here and you can see the questions that every reviewer is going to get. And you can see the first question is about discoveries. Those surprising findings likely to stimulate further exploration. The discovery should not be easily explained by existing theories or frameworks. Please comment on whether such discoveries are part of the manuscript. The second one, as I mentioned, is about empirical exploration, not hypothesis testing, and about the novelty and interestingness of the phenomenon in the context. So we ask our reviewers to comment on that. And then the third one is we ask our reviewers to comment on the methodology. So those are our three big buckets. So if you are submitting to AMD, be aware of that, right? That's what you're going to be judged on. Of course, we give our reviewers a chance to comment about other things they like or other things that are problematic, but we've condensed the reviewer template into those 3 main questions to really try to focus the reviews and focus the feedback for you. So be thinking about that before you submit your article to AMD. I also mentioned submitting to AMD. You'll find a whole page on submitting to AMD, including types of submissions with the traditional papers and discoveries in brief, and a section on traditional paper structure. If you are thinking about submitting to AMD, look at this, right? Look at what should be contained in your introductory paragraphs, what should be contained in the findings and in the discussion. You know, we've put a lot of work into trying to help authors so that, you know, you don't run into desk rejects or desk edits, and that you have the best chance of not only getting your article into review, but also that of getting your paper published in the journal. Okay, with that, I will stop sharing. Actually, the last thing, let me pull this up for just 1 second, is our virtual meetings. So obviously we can't do face-to-face meetings right now. No one is doing face-to-face meetings, but we are committed to helping our authors out. And we will be having our first virtual paper development workshop in November. There will be more information on the website about that soon. There's 2 ways to get into these workshops. One is to apply, and there will be an application that will be due sometime at the sort of near the end of October. And that will be a shorter proposal. I will look at those proposals. I'll decide, you know, who's going to be let into the workshop and who's not. And we keep those workshops fairly small because we want there to be a fairly low ratio between facilitators and those that they're working with. And we really only take ideas or proposals where the authors have a fairly good idea of what AMD is. And when you're accepted to do a workshop, you also get some pre-work, some information about the journal that you'll sort of go through, so that once we get to the workshop, it'll be a lot of one-on-one work with your facilitator. The other way is, depending on the type of paper, we will occasionally also, when we reject a paper, we'll reject a paper, but say, you're into the next workshop if you'd like. So you don't need to formally apply, but we see some potential in your idea and in your manuscript, but we don't think it's going to be successful and sort of in another round of review. So we put you into that virtual workshop. Again, it's up to you if you want to attend, but it's another way we populate those workshops. So we're committed to doing 3 in this first year. Again, the first one will be in November. So with that, I will stop. Tim, anything else you want to say while I look at the chat for possible questions?
No, if you want, I've answered a couple of questions on the chat. I can feed you a couple of the questions if that makes it easier.
That'd be great.
Okay, so here's one question that's been posed. Can you please talk about a sample paper structure?
Yeah, so I think maybe I've already addressed that a little bit. We do have the sample paper structure for traditional papers on the website in the submitting to discoveries page. And we go through on that website what should be in the introductory paragraphs, what's typically in the findings, and what's in the discussion. Again, it's really important to look at that because it's different than other empirical journals. For discoveries in brief, we don't have a template on purpose because we want that to be a little more creative and a little more open. Obviously, once we get a couple of papers accepted under discoveries in brief, we'll be better able to provide more of a template for that type of submission.
Okay, great. And that's a feed into just question: are discoveries in brief peer reviewed, or are they only editorial team reviewed?
They are peer reviewed, and so all of the discoveries in brief articles are handled either by myself or by Eric Dane, who I mentioned is at Washington University in St. Louis. Eric is very passionate about creative writing and bringing innovation to our writing. I am as well. In fact, Eric and I wrote a very non-traditional essay in Journal of Management Inquiry last year. Maybe it just came out this year, but we wrote it a couple years ago. So, we've been talking about this a long time, long before either of us were involved with AMD. This is one of our initiatives to manage this. So when either of us gets a paper, we will send it out for review. But what we do is we have a structure by which the DIB paper, or the discoveries and brief papers, will go to usually one content expert, and then one discoveries and brief reviewer. So we have, I think it's about 10 members of our editorial review board that are also passionate about creative writing and bringing innovative ideas to management writing. And so they've already sort of signed on to review these papers. So each of them will be assigned to the paper as well. So you will get feedback both on the content, obviously, as well as the writing. The reviewer template will also look a little bit different for the discoveries and brief, because obviously those folks are going to want to talk a little bit more about the writing style and the narrative structure, which is probably less of a focus for a traditional paper.
Okay, and again, so people are aware, if you want to put a question in, remember that the chat is it's on the page for the actual session, so you actually have to sort of pop outside to your program where the session is, and then you'll see the chat box in the lower right-hand corner, and then you can put in a question. Okay, here's another one. Kevin, would you have any tips or requirements for qualitative papers submitted to AMD?
Yes, so good question. There's actually quite a bit of research, a qualitative research that has appeared in AMD. In fact, about 40% roughly of the research in AMD has been qualitative. So obviously, because qualitative sort of lends itself to empirical exploration and abductive and inductive work, a lot of folks find a home for their qualitative work in AMD. I would say that what's most important, and this is probably true for any paper, but it's definitely true for qualitative, is when you send in your paper to AMD, if it's focused on qualitative, be sure to bring your phenomenon and your context out first, right? Like, put us in that world. It happens a lot where individuals write, these sort of really interesting papers, and a lot of the interestingness and the things that they've seen in their context, or as they sort of went through their data collection, it gets lost or it gets buried in the methods. You don't have to do that at AMD. I think a great example is some of Gail Whiteman's work. Gail was a previous, or she's just coming off as being an associate editor at AMD. She's done some really fascinating work and some really interesting contexts. And within the first couple of pages, wow, I understand what these companies or what these individuals or whatever are going through. And maybe that's putting quotes in your introduction, to get us sort of hooked into that context or into that world. I think those are all ways that you can really bring your qualitative data to life. What you don't want to do, and you might do this for AMJ or ASQ, is write a 12-page lit review on some theory. It's not really relevant for AMD. The theory you need to talk about in AMD is essentially, why do we not know something, right? You need to motivate your research question. And your research question is really, why did you go out and study this phenomenon? So your whole front end should be building towards that idea that it was critical for us to go and talk to these individuals, or go and collect this. Maybe you did a content analysis or whatever it is that you did with your qualitative data. So those would be a couple of tips. But in terms of the findings and the structure of how you present, it actually might look quite similar to what you would see in other empirical journals.
Yeah, and I want to add just something to that, Kevin, and build on what you just said, because, as someone who does a lot of qualitative research myself, and, studies healthcare specifically, right? I mean, like you said, this is the kind of journal where you want to bring the context to life around your phenomena. You don't want to hide it and you don't want to bury it. So, for example, if you're looking at something in healthcare around, why can't we get physicians to do something, right? And it's important for a paper that comes to AMD to talk about, the context of healthcare, the realities of power dynamics between physicians and hospitals and healthcare organizations. So you want to bring that to life because that's part of what you're, as a researcher, interested in finding more about, right? So I would definitely second, that whole notion that context. I think that's why this journal is kind of so interesting, because it doesn't ask you to minimize the context surrounding the phenomenon you're looking at. It actually asks you to amplify it and talk to the readers about it. Okay, we have couple of probably easier questions, hopefully, to answer. How can I learn about the application of the upcoming paper workshop? Will be posted on the AMD webpage or on AOM Twitter. So I don't know if you have any details on that yet.
Sure. And now that I've seen Tim talk and how nice his background is, I have to get rid of my dank background and put up our campus, which this is George Mason, obviously in the spring, which none of us saw this year. Yes, there will be information. In fact, there is a link to all of the Academy Journal workshops on the Academy page. It's not just an AMD link. And I believe if you go to the website and you go to journals, so menu, research, journals, and there is a, I thought there was a link to workshops on that page. A good question. Susan, do you know? Susan, are you still there?
Hold on. I just posted it to the chat.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, there is a link on the AMD page. I thought there was one for all of the journals as well.
That's what I posted.
Okay, great. Yep. Yep. So you'll see a description of the AMD Virtual Paper Development Workshop on the bottom of our homepage, or sort of maybe halfway down. And the first three will be November, and then next March and next July. We of course had face-to-face ones scheduled, and everything has been canceled for now.
Okay, Kevin, this is from Andy Vandeven. Kevin, I'm delighted and thankful for AMD's good and creative hands you and your team are providing AMD. Could you provide a brief update on AMD's progress in terms of papers submitted and accepted, and when do you expect AMD might be granted an impact factor? Yeah,
great. Of course, Andy, the first editor of AMD. It's almost like I planted him in the audience to ask us these very, very important questions. I very much appreciate it. So I'll start with papers submitted. So AMD has been steadily increasing in terms of papers submitted. Our acceptance rate is very similar to other premier journals, running around 10% or so. So we've gone steadily up in terms of, we're nowhere near like AMJ, which is, I think they said was 1,600 papers in the last year. We might have between 200 and 300 papers a year, including our special issues. So we're obviously much, much smaller. But it's still going up, and we obviously want folks to send their work to AMD. We now have 5 papers per issue. We're going to 6 papers per issue, and so there's more and more content coming out of AMD, which we're really excited about. The other thing I didn't mention, this is a good time to mention it before I get to the impact factor, is we do some really innovative stuff at AMD with our papers. So if you haven't looked at an AMD paper before, you'll see a couple things that you don't see at other journals. First is embedded in each paper are authors' voices. And this gives our authors a chance to give short, 2 to 3 minute snippets where they talk about the data collection process or what they saw or what they're passionate about. It's actually a great way to really get a sense of what the authors did without having to read the entire paper. The other thing is we do animated whiteboards for all of our empirical papers. Again, these are short, only a couple of minutes. but they're great. And I use them in my MBA class. And we'll send them, we'll send them out, and it's, they summarize the discovery of the paper, I think it's a great tool, and they're spread widely and they're viewed widely. So, and then finally, we also do data visualizations, which we've now done a couple of, where you as the reader can go in and actually play with the data a little bit to see how sort of trends or relationships move depending on certain levels of the variable. So. We're doing all of that stuff. All of that stuff is relatively new, or improving as we go along, and we're thrilled about that. Even though we don't necessarily handle as many manuscripts. With regard to the impact factor, we do not have an impact factor, as Andy noted. We don't necessarily know when it's coming because it's a bit of a hidden process. Impact factors are run by a company. A private company that actually I think is the same company that runs Manuscript Central, if you guys have ever sent in a paper to a management journal. And what has happened with our impact factor is when the journal was going and started up, Andy actually and Peter Bamberger, the prior editor, actually did a great thing, and they were encouraging folks to send in commentaries, which are short sort of essays commenting on published articles. And we think what happened is that while those were only intended to be, appendices really to any sort of journal issue, they were included in the calculations for the impact factor. So while our articles are actually getting cited quite well, in fact, we've done the calculations, and AMD should rank in the top 12 to 15% of all management journals, which would put us at between about 20 and 30 on the list of over 200 journals, which is actually pretty impressive. With these commentaries included, they've been reluctant to give us an impact factor because they think we're publishing too much that is not getting cited. We have rectified that. We're working to solve that problem. We're working to include commentaries in other ways. We're hopeful, while it may take a couple of extra years to get an impact factor, the raw data suggests our journal is incredibly strong. And if anybody is going up for tenure or needs to make a case for why an AMD paper should be considered, a top tier publication, please let me know and I will help you make that case.
And indeed, could I add to that a bit, Kevin, to
Sure,
say,
Andy.
yes, indeed, those additional commentaries that we wanted to develop in order to create more correspondence between readers and is sort of backfiring when it comes to an impact factor, because those commentaries never were designed to be cited. But for us, for now, I guess it is up to us now to emphasize that in light of not having an impact factor, it is to suggest, well, my goodness, the papers that are being published in AMD are by the very best scholars.
Yes.
And indeed, they are the leaders of new thinking in our field, so that by virtue of being associated with papers that are published by such eminent scholars in the Academy of Management Discoveries, we should recognize a high recognition factor. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. And Andy's absolutely correct. In fact, if you look not only at the papers that have been published in AMD, but also at our distinguished board members, and even our normal editorial review board members, it's quite remarkable how many folks are passionate about the journal and what we are trying to do, and really completing the stage of knowledge development, which is across the academy, which was part of Andy's original vision, and I give him and his team and Peter and his team a lot of credit for that.
Thanks. Thanks.
Okay, so these should be hopefully fairly cut and dry questions to answer. First, Kevin, is there a place where someone could access an exemplary sample paper, both on the qualitative side and the quantitative side, to sort of see what a great AMD paper looks like?
Yeah, really good question. I'm always hesitant to give examples because there are so many good ones. I will say, though, that if you go to the FAQ page on the website, one of the questions, and this is about halfway down, it says, what kinds of papers and methodologies are accepted at AMD? And we give examples of prototypical qualitative papers, meta-analyses and replications. There's a simulation that appeared in AMD, experimental papers, mixed methods, excuse me, construct validation papers, and so forth. So while that's not necessarily, these are the best qualitative and quantitative, I think those papers are all excellent, and that will give you a sense of, of really sort of what we're looking for at AMD. Even in the issue, and I don't know if everybody reads their AOM, emails that come out every day, but I believe that the latest issue in AMD just came out this morning and might be in your email inbox. And there's a couple of papers, even in that issue, if you want to go look at the paper on, let me go and I'll tell you what order they are in. So there is a paper on bias, and I believe this was the first one. Yeah, so the first article, No Room at the Inn, Disability Access in the New Sharing Economy. This is actually a paper about diversity and bias at Airbnb. Really interesting and fascinating paper. The second paper, also fascinating, do coaches in the NBA actually display racial bias? So this was our first replication paper. And what I like about this paper is, these authors looked at another paper that had shown that NBA coaches essentially are biased against their Black players. And they sit them more, they don't play them as much when they should play them, and so forth. And what these authors said is, wait a second, we're actually not sure about that. They went and they looked at the data, and they found that when you actually account for sitting your starters at the end of a game, all of the racial bias effects disappear. It's a fascinating discovery, and really sort of challenges some of the racial bias research and opens the door for some other theorizing. So even in the article today, there's a couple of papers, and just go look at those animated whiteboards as well if you don't have time to read the whole paper.
Great. Okay. And does the journal accept provocative conceptual pieces or commentaries, especially for topics that don't have a theoretical framework?
No commentaries, no conceptual papers, all empirical.
Okay. Another question related. Does the journal publish any meta-analysis if the study discusses a phenomenon that is answered by existing theories?
Yes, meta-analyses are welcome. It's definitely a valid a type of methodology you can use, especially if you're looking at a series of studies, and it doesn't necessarily need to all be in management, right? It could be in management or economics or psychology, and maybe there's conflicting theory, or maybe there's not a lot of pre-existing theory that was given in those articles. And you want to summarize that, and you want to show that there's something interesting going on, or that you found something interesting sort of across these studies. Meta-analysis would be fine in that case, but not a review article, right? So a review would be more of a conceptual piece that would go to a review journal like Annals. Conceptual papers, of course, would go to, if you're looking to go to an academy journal, would go to AMR.
Yeah, and that's good you touched on that. We had a question earlier that I answered asking about the difference between Annals and AMD, and one of the differences I raised is, Annals is really more for more robust review type papers, kind of exploring what we know about something and, where we can potentially build on it, right?
Yeah, and we also often get the question, what's the difference between AMD and AMJ?
Yep,
Well, findings might look similar in those, in those two journals. AMD is a context-forward journal, and AMJ is a theory-forward journal, right? So AMJ, the point of the front end is to show how you are contributing to theory, what theory you are challenging, how you are building in that area. You should be motivating your discussion with a theoretical gap or a theoretical puzzle or a theoretical problem. At AMD, you're motivating with the context and the phenomenon and what we don't understand about that phenomenon, right? So those are the main differences between AMD and AMJ.
And let's, while we're at it, why don't you throw in the difference between AMD and AMP?
Yeah, so AMP has a relatively new mission statement, and AMP is really focused on public policy. So if you have a paper, and they accept different types of papers as well, but it really needs to have policy implications. And if you want a nice discussion about AMP, you can actually go back and watch the 10-minute talk that Phil Fan gave on AMP in the Meet the Editors session, which was on Thursday. That video is up. I've already looked at it, and he goes over that new mission statement.
Okay, more of a general question. How much empirical exploration is appropriate in an AMD article? For example, in qualitative studies, how much is going to be enough? It's kind of a little bit of a larger question, but maybe you have some thoughts.
Yeah, so this is a difficult one to answer, right? Because it is subjective. But what we're looking for is the magnitude of the discovery, right? So it's not necessarily how much data you have or, how many pages of transcripts or whatever. It's really about, does this discovery have some really important implications for the management field, right? And how we think about a context or a phenomenon, or how other researchers might go and investigate something in this, in this context. So that's really the bar, is the interestingness, the novelty, and the importance of the discovery. And then the empirics need to be strong enough to defend that discovery, right? So just because the discovery is really interesting, if you only have 3 interviews, well, do we really have enough, confidence that that's what you found? Then it really becomes more of a conceptual paper. So, the bar for empirics is really very similar to what it would be at AMJ or any other top empirical journal. It's just that what we're looking for is a little bit different in terms of, we're looking for the discovery and your data to defend that discovery, and the empirics, we should have belief that the empirics are supporting that. And there are, obviously there are times where in the review process, you're asked to collect more data or explore your data set further, because maybe it's, the level of discovery is not quite there yet.
Okay, we have a few more minutes. We're still waiting. Oh, okay, here's another question. Are papers related to international management and strategy often published and submitted?
We would love to have more. So yes, they are published. Yes, they are submitted. But I think it's because we had, Peter is a little bit more on the micro side. I'm a little bit more on the micro side, although we've each sort of have dabbled in multi-level research. We very much want strategy research. We want macro level research. We want archival research. The archival research has actually gone up a little bit over the last few years in terms of what we published, which is great. Please send in your stuff. We're looking to reach every corner of the academy.
Could you maybe also, Kevin, if you could comment on, traditionally over the past several years, I mean, do we know generally what the bulk of the submissions, kind of what areas they generally come from?
Yeah, I do. And maybe I can even, hold on, I can even share that with you. If I can pull it up. Here it is. I'm just looking at, I believe it's this. If this isn't it, I'll just fake it here. Yeah, here it is. So let me share my screen here for folks that are interested. This is not a perfect synopsis, so don't hold me to this. But we can see the submission keywords before 2017 and since 2017. The biggest category is OBHR, followed by strategy, TIM, OT, and so forth. Obviously, some of these you could combine. This is just one way to show the data. In terms of what's being submitted, it is held fairly steady, although we see a slight dip in strategy. This is why I say we would love to have more strategy submissions. We are definitely open to strategy. We have some. excellent strategy scholars as associate editors. Then for methodology, we've seen a bit of an uptick in terms of qualitative and a little bit down in terms of quantitative. Experiment has held fairly steady. And again, we'd love to have more quantitative material again, to reach all areas of the academy. And we've actually put folks on the editorial team that are excellent quant experts. So we are hoping that encourages folks to send in their macro strategy and quant research.
Great. Okay. Still have time for a few more questions. Here's one. AMJ puts weightage on the theoretical contributions important to particular divisions and interest groups. Is it the same for AMD? For example, do reviewers check for a specific fit with the article for division interest groups?
I'm not sure what that means.
Yeah, I think probably maybe you could talk a little bit about, are there particular, areas of the academy that, I think you kind of already covered it in terms of maybe desiring more international strategy articles. Any other areas that you think the journal particularly is looking for articles in?
No, we want to be balanced, right? We want to be open to all areas of the academy. I would love if folks from every division feel comfortable sending their work to AMD. I think all of us do empirical explorations. And I think we often do it thinking we're testing these great hypotheses, but maybe those hypotheses don't work out, but we see something interesting in our data, and we want to publish that. Send that to AMD, right? That's a perfect example. And I think we do this no matter whether we're in strategy or entrepreneurship or HR or OB or MOC or TIM, OCIS, go down the list, right? I think we all do this because it's part of the research process. And we say at AMD that we have a more honest and transparent process. You don't have to engage in those theoretical gymnastics to try to get in another journal. You can actually have a different voice, make a different contribution. And we hope an even easier path to publication. If you have something that's really compelling and interesting, we want to publish it and we want to work with you.
Question here. I'm going to see if I can sort of distill it a little more. Can you comment a little bit on the trade-off you see between the theoretical, the novel discovery that an article might make versus the fact that article might have a smaller sample size or a smaller sort of group of data? Is there a particular sort of bar that the journal looks at in terms of, and this person's basically saying, if I'm doing international research, I might be able to not collect as many data points, looking at something in another country versus the US, and is that going to be a problem?
Yeah, those are tough questions to answer because it depends. It depends on the veracity of your data, all right? If you have in-depth cases where we really have a strong sense of what's going on in your data, or with if it's individuals, if this is like qualitative, and maybe you talk to them over time, you have a nice sense of the process, that's different than sort of one-shot interviews, right? It just depends on what you're trying to show, and sort of the quality that is contained in your data. So no, there is no one specific bar. This would be a very similar answer if you were to ask the folks at AMJ. I've been on the AMJ editorial review board for a long time. I've published at AMJ. It's no different, right? It would be the same answer if you go there.
Okay, so we're out of questions on the chat. We've got about 2 minutes left. Kevin, I don't know if you want to, give a few more closing remarks, or we did have one more question that came in. What would you like to do?
I have just a couple of quick things to say, but what's the last question?
To what extent should explorations be relevant for management practice rather than broader explorations at the boundaries of theory? So really this idea of exploring for practice advancement versus exploring for sort of helping to build theory. What does the journal have a leaning either way?
Yeah, a good question. you need to have a phenomenon, right? And the phenomenon needs to be based on something in the real world. Now, maybe you discover that phenomenon by looking at the literature, or by looking at data, or by looking at the world. I mean, there's lots of ways to come up with phenomenon, but we want articles that speak to multiple audiences. And even the animated whiteboards, right? The whiteboards, if you go and look at them, they're not whiteboards just for academics. In fact, the whiteboards are really for managers or people who want to understand the phenomenon better. So that's how I would answer that. So no, go ahead, Tim.
No, go ahead. It's all, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so I if there are other questions, I'll be sure to go through the chat and respond to you. You can also obviously reach out to me directly, or any of the other Tim or the other associate editors. I want to thank Tim for being here and moderating. That was a huge help today. And I'll leave you with a couple of challenges to publishing an AMD. I've already mentioned a couple. One is just sending your paper in from another journal. Don't do that. It's going to waste your time. And while I'm happy to look at it and tell you, you know, you have hypotheses, this is not what we do at AMD. You know, do your research before you send stuff into AMD. There's plenty of exemplars out there, and we've tried to provide a lot of information for you to do a good job at AMD. Because of that, we probably have a little bit higher desk reject or desk edit rate than most journals. Don't let that discourage you, please. If I send you a desk reject, it's not because I hate you or you should never send your stuff back to the journal. We want your research. We want you to work on it. And we want you to take that feedback and improve. We definitely have a mindset of continual improvement at the journal. We try to give our reviewers feedback as well. So if you're interested in reviewing for the journal, please reach out, create an account, and we'll try to get you some manuscripts. And again, for our authors, we want to be very developmental, and because we know we're still a young journal, we know that there's a lot of education to be done, and we take that, you know, we take that very seriously. We're here to help, and I'm always happy to help. It's part of why I'm excited about this job, and I'm thrilled about our new initiatives, especially Discoveries in Brief. So if you have any inkling for sending stuff to AMD and you're hesitant at all, please do reach out, let us know, and we'll be sure to help you out. And thank you all for attending today. I hope you found it worthwhile.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks everyone for coming.